Somewhere off the coast of Denmark in the cold gray water on the floor of the North Sea are 25 shipwrecks. They've been there for 110 years. Inside their twisted hulls are the remains of more than 8,000 men, sealed in the dark since the long midsummer evening of May 31st, 1916, when the steel coffins were nailed shut by gunfire. They belong to two navies, two empires, and the largest fleet action ever fought on the surface of the earth. Their names, Indefatigable, Queen Mary, Invincible, Lutzow, Pommern, and Black Prince, are now barely remembered outside maritime museums and the families who never had a grave to visit. But on the night they died, the entire course of the Great War hung over the water with them. And for a few hours, both London and Berlin believed the world had just tilted on its axis. This is the story of the Battle of Jutland. But let's talk about how these men got to this place. For Britain, the Royal Navy wasn't simply an arm of the state. It was the state, raised to the level of religion. Since Trafalgar in 1805, the British people had assumed, almost without examining the assumption, that the sea belonged to them, and that this fact alone kept their island fed, their empire connected, and their enemies starving. By 1916, that assumption had been transferred almost entirely to one man, Admiral Sir John Rushworth Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet. Winston Churchill, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty when the war began, later wrote that Jellicoe was, quote, the only man on either side who could lose the war in an afternoon, end quote. It's the most quoted line in the history of British naval thought, and it's also the most damning. Because what Churchill meant was that Britain did not need Jellicoe to win at sea. It only needed him not to lose. The dreadnoughts of the Grand Fleet, riding at anchor in the bleak waters of Scapa Flow and Orkney, were not a weapon. They were a vault, and the gold inside the vault was the British Empire itself. For Germany, the calculation was the mirror image. Kaiser Wilhelm II's high seas fleet had been built at an enormous expense over the past 20 years, partly to challenge British naval supremacy and partly out of the Kaiser's personal envy of his cousins in London. Remember, he is Queen Victoria's eldest grandson. Since August 1914, it had spent the war mostly in port. The British distant blockade enforced from Scapa and from the Channel was strangling Germany an inch at a time. By the spring of 1916, the harvests were failing, ration cards had been introduced for almost every staple good, and Berlin's strategists knew that another year of this would put the Reich on its knees before any decision could be reached on the Western Front. And so the fleet had to do something. But the fleet could not match the Grand Fleet ship for ship. Britain had 28 modern dreadnoughts to Germany's 16, and 9 battlecruisers to Germany's 5. If the two main battle lines ever met in open water, the result would not be Trafalgar. It would be slaughter. And so Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, the commander of the High Seas Fleet since January of that year, planned a careful seduction. He would send Vice Admiral Franz Hipper's fast battlecruisers, known to the Germans as the First Scouting Group, north along the Danish coast as bait. The British battlecruiser force under Vice Admiral David Beatty would, predictably, come south from its base in the Firth of Forth to chase Hipper. Hipper would lead Beatty towards Scheer's full battle line, which would be following at a distance of 50 miles, hidden by smoke and by the weather. When Beatty's battlecruisers blundered into the High Seas Fleet, Scheer would isolate them, cut them off, and destroy them piecemeal. With the British battlecruiser force eliminated, the numerical balance in the North Sea would tilt suddenly and dramatically toward Germany, and a real Trafalgar might at last become possible. The operation was planned for the morning of May 31st, 1916. But what Scheer did not know was that British naval intelligence had been reading his mail. Tucked behind an unmarked door on the first floor of the Admiralty's old building in Whitehall sat Room 40, the British Naval Cryptographic Service. Since the wreck of the German light cruiser SMS Magdeburg in the Baltic in August 1914, when a Russian boarding party had recovered the German signal book from the dead body of a signalman lashed to a rail, the British had been steadily reading German naval ciphers. On the 28th of May, Room 40 began intercepting an unusual volume of traffic suggesting the high seas fleet was preparing to sail. By the evening of the 30th, the intercepts were specific enough that the Admiralty ordered Jellicoe to take the entire Grand Fleet to sea immediately. While Scheer was still tying up loose ends in Wilhelmshaven, 24 British dreadnoughts under Jellicoe slipped out of Scapa Flow, and a further 4 battleships in the battlecruiser fleet under Beatty stood out from Rosyth. Both forces were to converge on a position roughly 90 miles west of the Jutland Peninsula, the broad chin of Denmark that pokes into the North Sea. The hunter had no idea he was being hunted. 2 intelligence failures, however, partially canceled this advantage. The first was a mistake of method. In Berlin, before sailing, Scheer had transferred his flag call sign, DK, from his flagship SMS Friedrich der Grosse to the harbor wireless at Wilhelmshaven. He did this every time he went to sea to confuse anyone listening. The Director of Operations Division at the Admiralty, Rear Admiral Thomas Jackson, was not on speaking terms with Room 40 and disliked asking the codebreakers for advice. On the afternoon of the 31st, he marched downstairs, asked them only for the current location of call sign DK, was told it was at Wilhelmshaven, and marched back upstairs, satisfied that Scheer himself was still in port. The signal he then sent Jellicoe arrived at the worst possible moment. It suggested that the German fleet was not yet at sea, just as Jellicoe's scouts were about to make contact with it. The second failure was one of geography. Both sides had each issued vague rendezvous coordinates to their own scouts. Both expected only a partial engagement. Neither commander, as he steamed toward the bank, was fully aware that he was about to fight the largest naval battle since Trafalgar. At a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 31st of May, in a slate-gray haze that promised neither sun nor rain, the Danish steamer NJ Fjord stopped to vent steam in the empty water between the 2 enemy fleets. Imagine being in this position at this moment. By coincidence, she was sighted simultaneously by the British light cruiser HMS Galatea and by the German torpedo boats B-109 and B-110. Galatea hoisted the signal "enemy in sight" at 20 minutes past 2. It was the first signal of the battle, and it was sent because of a freighter that had nothing to do with the war. Beatty wheeled his battlecruisers, Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger, New Zealand, and Indefatigable, toward the smoke on the horizon, joined by the 4 magnificent fast battleships of the 5th Battle Squadron under Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas, Barham, Valiant, Warspite, and Malaya. These were the new Queen Elizabeth-class super dreadnoughts, the most powerful warships in the world at the time. But Beatty, in a signaling error that would echo throughout the rest of the day, raced south at 25 knots without confirming that Evan Thomas had received his change of course. The 5th Battle Squadron, slower to react, fell 10 miles behind. Beatty had effectively decided to fight Hipper's 5 battlecruisers with 6 of his own, throwing away the decisive firepower advantage of the 15-inch guns of the Queen Elizabeths for nearly an hour. Hipper, the German hunter who was himself the hunted, turned south to lead Beatty toward Scheer's main body. Fire was opened at about 10 minutes to 4 in the afternoon at a range of roughly 18,000 yards. The Germans had an advantage at this moment because the afternoon light gave them an advantage. Beatty's ships were silhouetted against a brightening western sky, while Hipper's own ships were lost in the haze of the east. And because of that, the Germans drew first blood almost at once. Their gunnery was superior in fire control, faster in salvo cycles, and more accurate at range. The British battlecruisers had been designed by Admiral Sir John Fisher under the doctrine that speed is armor. They sacrificed protection for the ability to outrun anything they could outshoot, and to outshoot anything they could outrun. In a slugging match against well-armored German battlecruisers, that doctrine was about to be tested in the cruelest possible way. At 4:02 in the afternoon, after only about 14 minutes of action, the British battlecruiser HMS Indefatigable, last in the line, was struck near her aft turret by 2 or 3 shells from the German battlecruiser Von der Tann. There was a brief pause, a flash, and then a black mushroom of smoke and debris that lifted her into the sky. Indefatigable rolled over and disappeared. Of her crew of more than 1,000 men, ultimately only 3 survived. They were picked up by the Germans and spent the rest of the war in a prison camp. 24 minutes later, the same horror repeated itself. HMS Queen Mary, the most modern of Beatty's battlecruisers and the gunnery champion of the Royal Navy, was struck by shells from the German battlecruisers Derfflinger and Seydlitz. Witnesses on neighboring ships described a vivid red flame that ran the length of her hull and then an enormous detonation that broke her in half. As Tiger steamed past, sailors on her bridge described looking down into a column of smoke and seeing Queen Mary's propellers still slowly turning in the air, 60 feet above the water, as her stern continued forward on its own momentum. Queen Mary's bow disappeared instantly. The stern took a few more minutes to follow. Of her crew, 1,266 men were killed. Only around 20 survived. It was at this moment, with 2 of his great ships gone in less than a half hour and more than 2,000 British sailors dead already, and with a third, what ultimately turned out to be false report coming in that HMS Princess Royal had also been blown up. It's then that Vice Admiral Beatty turned to his flag captain, Chatfield, on the bridge of HMS Lion and made one of the most repeated remarks of the war. "Chatfield, there seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." Understatement. The investigations that followed Jutland would conclude that the problem was not the ships, or at least not only the ships. It was the cordite. The British had been relentlessly pursuing the ability to have a high rate of fire. It had become a point of pride among Beatty's battlecruiser crews that they could fire 5 rounds per gun per minute. And because of that, gun captains had wedged open the anti-flash doors between the turret working chambers and the magazines, and they had stockpiled extra silk cordite bags in the handling rooms, allowed for them to fire at a higher rate, but it also was incredibly dangerous. The chain that ran from the magazine deep in the ship to the gun on the turret roof had become a long, open passage filled with explosives. When a German shell penetrated a British turret, the flash did not stop at the shell room. It traveled down. 600 tons of cordite would detonate in less than a second. The ship would not so much as explode as turn instantly to a column of fire and steel splinters. The men inside vaporized before they even had time to register their surprise. The German ships had nearly suffered the same fate at the Battle of Dogger Bank in January of 1915, when the battlecruiser Seydlitz nearly lost her aft turrets to a propellant fire. After that battle, the Imperial Navy had hardened its anti-flash procedures, redesigned its propellant bags to be less prone to ignition, and disciplined its crews ruthlessly on magazine safety. The British had not. The cost of that decision was now to be counted in coffins that would never be filled because there were no bodies to put them in. There was one British battlecruiser that did not blow up because one man would not let it. At about 4 o'clock, when Indefatigable was still sinking, a German shell from Lützow struck the center faceplate of Q turret aboard Beatty's flagship Lion. The roof was blown off. Almost everyone in the turret was killed. The turret commander, Major Francis John William Harvey, It's a lot of first names. Of the Royal Marine Light Infantry was lying mortally wounded on the deck. Both of his legs had been blown off below the knee. And he gave an order to close the magazine doors and flood the magazine. His sergeant carried out the order. A few minutes later, just as Harvey expected, a smoldering fire ignited the loose cordite charges in the turret's working chamber, sending a column of flame down toward where the magazine had been. Had the magazine still been open, HMS Lion would have ended the day like Queen Mary. Instead, the flame found water. Lion limped on. Major Harvey died of his wounds shortly afterward and was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. His name is the answer to a question history has, for 110 years, never quite known how to phrase. How is it that the war did not end at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on May 31st, 1916? At about 4:30, the British light cruiser HMS Southampton, scouting south of Beatty's battered force, made a sighting that changed the day. Over the southern horizon, mast after mast after mast was rising into view. The entire German high seas fleet, 16 dreadnoughts and 6 pre-dreadnoughts, and a forest of cruisers and destroyers, steaming north into the trap that Beatty had unwittingly walked into. Beatty's commanding officers, who had begun the day with 7 major ships and ended the first hour with only 5, were now staring down the full strength of the Imperial German Navy at point-blank range. Now, what followed has gone down in the histories as the run to the north. Beatty, with extraordinary nerve, ordered his battered force to come about 180 degrees and steam at full speed back in the direction they had come, straight north, toward Jellicoe and the Grand Fleet, drawing Hipper and Scheer behind him as if he were the bait and they were the goldfish. The roles had reversed entirely. Hipper had drawn Beatty south into Scheer's arms. Now Beatty was drawing Scheer north into Jellicoe's. The 5th Battle Squadron, which had still not closed the gap, finally arrived on the scene as Beatty turned, and its 4 super dreadnoughts engaged the leading German battleships at long range, scoring repeated hits on the König-class battleships at the head of Scheer's line, while themselves absorbing punishing fire. Warspite took 13 heavy shells during this phase. Malaya, hit by an even worse one near her forecastle, kept station and kept firing. The 5th Battle Squadron's stand during the run to the north is sometimes called the finest hour of British naval gunnery in the entire war. Meanwhile, Beatty didn't tell Jellicoe what was coming. This is the single most criticized lapse of communication during the battle. The British battlecruiser commander was famously contemptuous of paperwork and signaling, and he preferred to lead by intuition and dash. And his flag lieutenant, Ralph Seymour, had a long history of garbled, late, or even omitted signals. Beatty did flash a sighting report of enemy battle fleet, but he didn't tell Jellicoe the German fleet's course, its position, its speed, or its strength with any of the precision Jellicoe needed in order to maneuver 24 battleships that were deployed in 6 parallel columns across 30 square miles of water, and put them into a single firing line before the moment of contact. As Beatty's force came pounding north out of the haze toward the Grand Fleet, Jellicoe, pacing the compass platform of its flagship HMS Iron Duke, was effectively about to fight the entire German fleet without knowing exactly where it even was. In the entire history of war at sea, there have only been a handful of decisions that have ever been more consequential than the one that Jellicoe made at about 6:15 on the evening of May 31st, 1916. The Grand Fleet was steaming in cruising formation, 6 columns of 4 dreadnoughts each, abreast. To fight, those 6 columns had to become a single line, a chain of 24 battleships steaming bow to stern, one behind the other, all of their main guns pointing in the same direction. The decision was which way to deploy, to the left or to the right. Deploy left to the west, and the Grand Fleet would close the range and bring its guns to bear earlier. but if the maneuver were mistimed, it would meet the German line head-on in a melee. Deploy right to the east, and the Grand Fleet would briefly run away from the enemy and might miss the chance for a decisive engagement before sunset, which in the high latitudes of late May was already only 2 hours away. But the British line would form across the head of the German line, and the British ships would be silhouetted to the east against dim northern skies, while the Germans would be silhouetted to the west against the setting sun. Jellicoe had been pacing the compass platform for the entire afternoon, reading scraps of signals, plotting bearings, listening to gunfire behind the mist. He had maybe a minute to make his decision. Without consulting anyone except the navigator, he said, "Deploy east on the port wing column." It was, as it turned out, the correct decision. The deployment, executed at full speed and failing light, took the agreed-upon 20 minutes. As the British line formed up, Scheer's leading battleships, blundering north out of the smoke and the spray, emerged at about 6:30 directly into the path of the Grand Fleet's firing arcs. Jellicoe had crossed the T, the supreme tactical objective of every line of battle commander since the invention of the broadside. For maybe 10 minutes, every gun of the British line could fire on the leading German ships, while only the leading German ships could reply. The Germans staggered. König was hit. Markgraf was hit. Großer Kurfürst was hit. The water on the German side of the line was, in the words of one British officer, a forest of geysers walking forward toward them. And it was during these first few minutes that the third great British battlecruiser of the day was taken out. HMS Invincible, the world's first battlecruiser, the prototype of the entire breed, had joined Jellicoe earlier in the afternoon, leading the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron under Rear Admiral the Honorable Horace Hood. At about 33 minutes past 6, briefly silhouetted by a parting of the mist, Invincible was hit on its Q turret by 2 shells from the Lutzow and Derfflinger. As at Indefatigable as at Queen Mary, the flash reached the magazine. As at Indefatigable as at Queen Mary, the ship was instantly broken in two by a single titanic explosion. As the rest of the British line steamed past, sailors saw the two ends of Invincible, bow and stern, standing upright in the water on either side of the wreck, like 2 gravestones in a churchyard. The sea so shallow at the wreck site that the keel still touched the bottom. Now, this is an interesting thing to point out about the site of the Battle of Jutland, because the water where this battle took place is only anywhere from 130 to 200 feet deep. So we're talking about situations where ships that are sinking can easily touch the bottom while still sitting up out of the water, and that is what probably happened in this case. But anyway, of more than 1,000 men aboard this ship, 6 were rescued. Rear Admiral Hood, whose ancestor had commanded ships on the line under Nelson, was not among those who were rescued. Now, earlier, at about 20 past 6, the British armored cruiser HMS Defence, which was old, lightly armored, and badly placed, had charged across the front of the German line, attempting to finish the crippled German light cruiser SMS Wiesbaden. She was caught between the leading German dreadnoughts and the German battlecruisers and took a succession of salvos and exploded with all hands, 900 men. HMS Warrior, following, was savaged in the same exchange. She would limp away that night and sink the next morning, with most of her crew rescued by the seaplane carrier HMS Engadine in one of the small mercies of the day. It was now Scheer's turn to face the unthinkable. He had sortied to ambush Beatty's battlecruisers. He had instead steamed into the focused fire of the entire British Grand Fleet. The German line was being broken in pieces. If he held his course, his fleet would be destroyed by sundown. And so what he ordered next was a maneuver that no other navy in the world could have performed, and one that the Imperial German Navy had drilled in peacetime almost as a parade trick. And bear with me, I do speak some German, but this is a long word, and I apologize in advance. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it was known as the Gefechtskehrtwendung nach Starboard, the battle about turn to starboard. On a single signal, every battleship in the German line simultaneously executed a 180-degree turn in formation. The trailing ship turned first. Each ship in succession turned the moment its predecessor's bow had swung. In 7 minutes, the entire German high seas fleet had reversed course as one. It was performed at speed in failing visibility with overlapping smoke trails, with hits being scored on lead units, and without a single collision. Scheer's fleet disappeared in the western haze before the British gun crews fully understood what had happened. Jellicoe had no intention of breaking formation in order to give chase across a mine and torpedo-strewn sea at dusk, and so he let them go. But Scheer wasn't fully free yet. Between him and the German bases at Wilhelmshaven lay the British Grand Fleet, still between him and home. At about 5 minutes to 7, in a decision that German naval historians have been arguing about ever since, Scheer ordered a second execution of that same maneuver, this one back toward the British, back into the trap from which he had just escaped. He may have hoped to slip behind the British line under the cover of the mist. He may have lost his nerve momentarily. He may, as his post-battle report would claim, have intended a sharp surprise blow to throw the British off. Whatever his motive, at 10 minutes past 7, he found himself once again steaming straight at Jellicoe's deployed battle line, and this time Jellicoe crossed his T a second time, and the fire was even worse than before. To extract his fleet, Scheer now ordered what would go down in German naval legend as the death ride of the battlecruisers. Hipper's 4 surviving battlecruisers, 3 of them already badly mauled, and one of them, Lützow, slowly sinking, were ordered to charge straight at the British line at full speed, drawing fire and giving the dreadnoughts a chance to turn away under cover. They obeyed. They closed to within 7,700 yards of the British line and took a punishment that left every one of them on fire and half flooded. But every one of them survived. Behind them, the German battle line reversed course once again and disappeared westward in a screen of smoke and torpedo wakes laid by the destroyer flotillas. Jellicoe had issued a standing pre-battle order to his fleet that if there was a massed torpedo attack, they were to turn away so as to not lose the fleet. So that's what he did. He turned his ships 2 points to port and waited for the torpedo tracks to spend themselves. When he turned back, the German fleet was gone. The largest gun battle in the history of the world to that date had lasted, in essence, 28 minutes. Now, before anyone corrects me and tells me, well, no, the Battle of Jutland lasted a lot longer than a half hour. Yes, I understand that. I'm just talking about the main height of the action was really much like at, the Battle of the Somme, which was just a few weeks after this. Yes, it went on for months, but that main first action that cost so many British lives was really just a matter of minutes to hours on one morning in July. And much like that, this battle continues on, but the main action at this point is, for the most part, over. There were still 7 hours of darkness ahead, though, at this point in the story, and almost everything that mattered in those 7 hours happened in the wrong place at the wrong time. After his second battle turn, Scheer had decided to take the shortest route home, southeast toward Horns Reef and then south to Wilhelmshaven. To get there, he would have to pass behind the British fleet. Jellicoe, who expected Scheer to flee southwest instead, took the Grand Fleet south on a course that would intercept the Germans at dawn. The two fleets in the darkness were converging at an oblique angle, And through that intersection, Scheer drove his battered ships at a steady 15 knots, while Jellicoe steamed obliviously for a few miles to the east, listening to gunfire that he couldn't interpret. What he was hearing was the night action, the moment when, behind the dreadnoughts, the British destroyer flotillas of Captain Charles Wintour's 4th Destroyer Flotilla, Captain Stirling's 12th Flotilla, and others ran headlong again and again into the German battle line and were either destroyed in seconds or more rarely scored a torpedo hit and then ran for the smoke. HMS Tipperary, Wintour's flagship, was caught in the searchlights of the German battleship Westfalen and was shot to pieces. She sank with most of her hands. HMS Ardent, Fortune, Sparrowhawk, and Turbulent, all destroyers, were lost in successive close-range melees against German battleships. The British armored cruiser HMS Black Prince, having become separated from her squadron, blundered alone at about 1 o'clock in the morning directly between the columns of the German battle line. She was caught in the beams of multiple searchlights, hit at point-blank range by a storm of secondary armament fire from 5 German battleships, and exploded with all 857 of her crew. Her last sight, recorded by survivors of the nearby British destroyer Spitfire, was of a single ship turning into the night, on fire from stem to stern, before the magazines went up. 2 more German ships died in the dark hours as well. The pre-dreadnought battleship SMS Pommern, an obsolete coastal defense ship that Scheer had brought along to make up the numbers, was hit by a torpedo from the British destroyer HMS Onslaught at about 10 past 2 in the morning. She broke in two and sank with all 839 of her crew. She was the only battleship of either side lost in this engagement. And further south, the German battlecruiser SMS Lützow, which we've talked about quite a bit already, Hipper's flagship and the proudest unit of the 1st Scouting Group, was so badly flooded after 24 direct hits during the daylight action that her crew was taken off at 1:45 in the morning, and she was scuttled with torpedoes by the German destroyer G-38 before falling into British hands. By the time the sun rose over the North Sea on the morning of the 1st of June, the High Seas Fleet was already inside the protective minefields of Horn's Reef and steaming for home. Jellicoe, when he understood what had happened, turned the Grand Fleet north again and ran a search across waters from which the enemy had already departed. There would be no second engagement. The largest naval battle of the war was over. When the British public learned what had happened, first through a deliberately cautious Admiralty communique on the 2nd of June, and then through the savage editorial commentary of the London papers, well, the verdict was a thunderclap of disappointment. The British had been told for 2 years that their navy was the finest in the world. Now it had fought the long-awaited fleet engagement and had come home with 14 ships sunk, including 3 of her great battlecruisers, and over 6,000 men dead. The Germans had lost 11 ships and 2,500 men. By any tactical measure, tonnage sunk, men killed, hits scored, Germany had won the battle. Berlin's official communique, which beat London's to the press by a whole day, called it a great victory and arranged celebrations and decorations. Scheer, summoned to Wilhelmshaven, was awarded the Pour le Mérite. Hipper was made a baron. German schoolchildren were given a day off. But beneath the surface, both sides knew the truth, and the Germans knew it first. Scheer had taken his entire high seas fleet to sea, had been ambushed inside of a trap that he had set, and had escaped only because his fleet's seamanship was superb, and the British commander chose caution over annihilation. The Grand Fleet, for all its losses, was at sea and combat ready within 24 hours. The High Seas Fleet of the Germans was not. The German dockyards at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel would spend the rest of the summer repairing battleships and battlecruisers. Lützow was gone. Sedlitz was a hulk. Derfflinger, Moltke, Von der Tann, König, Grosser Kurfürst, Markgraf, every German capital ship that had been at Jutland and survived was by mid-July in a dock somewhere. The Royal Navy lost 3 battlecruisers in dramatic fashion. The Imperial German Navy had lost the use of its battle line for the rest of the year. When the British press eventually understood this, the verdict gradually began to shift. Within days, an unnamed American newspaper editor reportedly summarized Jutland in the line history has remembered. Quote, "The German fleet has assaulted its jailer, but it is still in jail." End quote. Churchill, writing later, called Jutland the trial of Britain's hand. It had not been Trafalgar, but it did not need to be Trafalgar. The Grand Fleet had done the one thing it was required to do. It had survived intact, and so, by extension, had the British Empire. Beatty's remark on the Bridge of Lion would haunt the Royal Navy for years afterwards. The suggestion that the great battlecruisers had been built wrong, manned wrong, and trained wrong, and that thousands of men had died for the institutional sin of preferring rate of fire over magazine safety. The internal inquiries were carried out quietly. The procedural reforms were implemented immediately. They would not be made public, though, for decades. The deepest consequences of Jutland, though, were not naval at all. They were strategic, and they reached far beyond the North Sea. On July 4th, 1916, just over a month after the battle, Scheer submitted a long report to Kaiser Wilhelm II. In it, with the directness for which he was known, he stated the obvious. The surface fleet, however well it had fought at Jutland, could not by itself force Britain to make peace. The blockade was tightening. The numerical balance in capital ships, far from being closed by Jutland, had, if anything, widened. To defeat Britain, Scheer wrote, Germany would have to attack British shipping, British trade, and British food supplies, and that meant unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats would have to once again be allowed to sink any vessel of any flag found in waters Germany declared to be a war zone, without warning and without inspection. This was the policy that had already once dragged Germany to the brink of war with the United States, back after the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. After that, Berlin had backed off. Now, with the High Seas Fleet effectively neutralized by Jutland, Berlin would no longer back off. On February 1st, 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Just 2 months later, the United States declared war. It was one of the great ironies of the war, and we have lingered on those ironies in the past in other episodes. A battle that Britain seems to have lost in the press and Germany seemed to have won, in fact, ended in a strategic defeat so total for Germany that it forced the very decision that brought the United States into the war and ensured Germany's eventual collapse. Falkenhayn at Verdun, the German general who had hoped to bleed France white, had made a similar miscalculation in 1916. Scheer had made his at Jutland. Together, their mistakes amounted to the slow strangulation of the Kaiserreich. In the autumn of 1916, the British press finally went looking for a hero of Jutland that the public could mourn without complication. They found one in a hospital ward in Grimsby, where the body of a 16-year-old gunlayer of HMS Chester had already been buried in a pauper's grave by his mother, who could not afford a stone. His name was Jack Travers Cornwell. He had been a boy first class, the most junior gunnery rating in the Royal Navy. At about 5:30 on the afternoon of May 31st, HMS Chester, scouting ahead of Rear Admiral Hood's battlecruisers, had been jumped by 4 German light cruisers, each her own size. The German fire had been concentrated and accurate. The forward gun crew on which Jack Cornwell served as the sight setter had been killed or terribly wounded by a single shell, all except for him. He had been pierced through the chest by a steel splinter, a wound that for a 16-year-old was certain death. When Chester broke off the action and limped to Immingham docks the next day, the rescuers found Jack Cornwell still at his station, still standing at his post by the gun mounting, gazing at his dead sight, quietly awaiting orders. He died of his wounds on the 2nd of June. He had not lived to see the press storm or the medals. His Victoria Cross was gazetted in September 1916 only after a public outcry forced the Admiralty to disinter his body and rebury him with full military honors. His grave at Manor Park in East London became one of the most visited shrines of the war. Boy Scouts adopted his name as the highest example of duty. The painting of Jack Cornwell at his gun by Frank Salisbury hangs at the Imperial War Museum in London. A 16-year-old's face, frozen and pale, the smoke of his ruined gun trailing past his ear. He is the human face of Jutland, the way Major Harvey is its quiet engineering miracle. Together, they say something the great strategic ledger of tonnage and tactics can never say, that the battle, like every battle, was fought by particular men in particular metal boxes in a particular cold gray sea, and the great consequences for empires and submarine doctrines and the dates of American intervention all rest on those men. 110 years on, the wrecks of Jutland are designated war graves under the Protection of Military Remains Act. Diving on them is restricted. The names of the lost are inscribed on the Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham naval memorials in Britain and at the Marine Ehrenmal at Labo near Kiel in Germany. Their hulks lie a few miles apart on the floor of the North Sea. HMS Queen Mary upside down at a depth of about 60 meters. HMS Indefatigable a few miles to her west. HMS Invincible broken in two at the position where her bow and stern stood upright in the water that day. SMS Pommern in pieces. SMS Lutzow not far from where she was scuttled. They're silent. They will always be silent. But the war they helped to settle, and the peace and the new wars that came after it, turned partly on what happened above them on that long midsummer evening. The British did not win the Battle of Jutland, but they didn't need to. They only needed to not lose it. And by the morning of the 1st of June, 1916, in the cold light of a North Sea dawn, they had not lost. The fleet was still at sea. The Empire was still fed. The inmate was still in his cell. And that was enough. Thanks for listening.